I remember the moment when I stopped being human. Not the surgery, not the first incision or the smell of burning flesh as they carved away pieces of my skull, not even the cold kiss of the cortical inhibitors as they slid into the grey matter of my frontal lobe. I remember something else entirely. I remember the last thought I had that was truly my own. It was about the color blue. There was a servitor in the Medicae bay where they brought me for processing. An old woman, or what had once been an old woman, with cables threaded through her eye sockets and pistons where her arms should have been. She was cleaning the floor with methodical, endless repetition, back and forth, the same 3 square meters for what might have been hours. Her skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over the metal framework that had replaced her ribcage. But her robe, Emperor preserve me, her robe was blue. Not the deep midnight blue of the ultramarines, not the electric cerulean of plasma discharge, but the soft, faded blue of a summer sky on some forgotten world. The kind of blue that makes you think of home, of childhood, of times when the galaxy seemed vast and full of wonder rather than an endless grind of suffering and toil. I stared at that blue fabric as the tech adepts prepared their instruments, and I thought about how beautiful it was, how strange that something so simple, so innocent, could exist in a place like this. How it reminded me of my sister's favorite dress, the one she wore to Mass on Throne Day, the one that made her look like she was wearing pieces of the sky. That was my last purely human thought, the recognition of beauty for its own sake, unmarked by utility or purpose, or the cold calculations that would soon replace everything I was. The lobotomization process begins long before the surgery. They told me this, in the brief moments of lucidity I had between the chemical restraints and the neural dampeners. A tech adept with a voice like grinding metal explained it with the clinical detachment of someone describing the weather. The mind must be prepared, he said, softened, made compliant. They start with isolation, sensory deprivation in chambers that strip away everything that makes you feel human. No light, no sound, no touch except the cold metal of the restraint harness. Time loses meaning. Minutes feel like hours, hours like days, days like decades. Your own heartbeat becomes deafening. Your breath sounds like a storm wind. The blood rushing through your ears becomes a symphony of terror. Then comes the conditioning. Subliminal whispers in high Gothic, prayers to the Omnissiah played at frequencies just below conscious awareness. Your sleeping mind absorbs the words, learns new patterns, new ways of thinking, efficiency, compliance, the sacred communion of flesh and machine, the blessed simplicity of servitude. They feed you just enough to keep you alive, but not enough to think clearly. Gruel laced with neural inhibitors, water that tastes of metal and electricity. Your body begins to forget what it means to be satisfied, to be comfortable, to be anything other than a vessel waiting to be filled with purpose. I fought it. At first, we all did. The human mind is remarkably resilient, capable of maintaining its sense of self even under the most brutal conditions. I held on to memories like precious stones, turning them over in my mind during the long dark hours. My name, my home world, the face of my mother weeping as the Arbites dragged me away for the crime of questioning a local governor's grain requisitions. Marcus. My name was Marcus Vex, of the hive world Tertius Prime, subsector Ultima, segmentum Solar, Hab Block 7.7, 7, level 85, compartment 4471. I worked the nutrient processing plants, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, 40 years of faithful service to the throne. I had a wife once, before the consumption took her. No children by the grace of the Emperor, though we tried for many years. These details became my anchor, my lifeline in the storm of mental dissolution. I repeated them like a litany, a prayer, a desperate attempt to remember what I had been before they decided I would be something else. But memory is fragile, and the tech priests are thorough. Each day brought new chemicals, new procedures, new violations of the sanctity of thought. They mapped my neural pathways with probes that felt like ice picks driven directly into my brain. They catalogued my fears, my hopes, my loves, marking each one for deletion or modification. I learned that I was not the only one. The conditioning chambers held dozens of us, men and women from across the sector, all guilty of the same fundamental crime. We had failed to serve the Imperium with sufficient zeal. We had questioned, we had hesitated, we had shown compassion when ruthlessness was required, or independence when obedience was demanded. The woman in the chamber next to mine had been a teacher on an agri world. She had refused to include certain approved texts in her curriculum, texts that described the proper way to denounce your neighbors for thought crimes. The man across the hall had been a factory supervisor who had spoken out against the working conditions that killed 3 workers every day. Another had been a scribe who had accidentally filed a report that contradicted the official casualty figures from a recent campaign. Small crimes, human crimes, the kinds of moral failures that marked us as unfit for normal service to the Emperor, but not so severe as to warrant simple execution. We were waste that could be recycled, flesh that could be repurposed, minds that could be edited and improved. The tech adept with the grinding voice visited each of us in turn, explaining our futures with the same mechanical precision he might use to describe the maintenance schedule for a cargo hauler. We would become servitors, he said. We would serve the Omnissiah and the Emperor with perfect loyalty, perfect efficiency, perfect emptiness. Our bodies would be modified as needed. Neural implants, mechanical limbs, organ replacements, whatever the role required. Our minds would be stripped of everything unnecessary, everything that might interfere with our designated function. Fear, love, ambition, curiosity, the capacity for suffering or joy or any emotion more complex than basic operational parameters. We would become tools, living tools, blessed with just enough consciousness to follow complex instructions, but nothing more. We would never again know hunger or thirst or pain in any meaningful sense. We would never know loneliness or sorrow or the desperate ache of unfulfilled desire. We would be free from the burden of choice, the agony of moral uncertainty, the terrible weight of individual responsibility. It was, he assured us, a mercy, a gift from the Omnissiah to those too weak to serve him properly as human beings. I watched him speak, his augmetic jaw clicking with each syllable, and I wondered if he had once been like us. If somewhere beneath all that metal and machinery, buried under decades of neural modification and mechanical enhancement, there remained some fragment of the man he had been. If he remembered what it felt like to doubt, to fear, to hope for something better than an eternity of soulless service, his optical sensors focused on me with the precision of a weapons targeting system. When he spoke, I could hear the faint wheeze of his respirator unit, the subtle hum of the cogitator that processed his thoughts before allowing them to reach his vocal cords. "You are wondering if I retain any measure of my original humanity," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection that might suggest amusement or annoyance. "This is a common curiosity among subjects awaiting conversion. The answer is complex." He paused, servos whirring almost inaudibly as he adjusted his position. "I remember my birth name. I remember fragments of my existence before my first modification. These memories serve a purpose, providing context for my current duties and ensuring optimal interaction with baseline humans. They are retained not out of sentiment, but utility." The red glow of his optical sensors never wavered. "You fear the loss of self, but you misunderstand what the self truly is. You believe consciousness to be some sacred flame, when in truth it is merely a pattern of electrical impulses, chemical reactions, synaptic connections that can be mapped, modified, improved. What you call humanity is simply inefficiency, chaos, the blessed randomness that prevents you from achieving your true potential." He moved closer to my restraint harness, close enough that I could smell the machine oil that lubricated his joints, the ozone scent of his electrical systems. "When you emerge from the conversion process, you will understand. The fears that torment you now will seem as distant and meaningless as the fears of childhood. You will be perfected, completed, free from the terrible burden of autonomous thought." I wanted to scream at him, to rage against the certainty in his voice, but the neural dampeners had reduced my capacity for strong emotion to a dull, muffled echo. Instead, I found myself asking a question that had been haunting me since my arrival. "How many?" I whispered through lips that felt thick and clumsy. "How many have you processed?" The tech adept's mechanical fingers drummed against his thigh with the precision of a metronome. In my tenure at this facility, I have overseen the conversion of approximately 47,312 individuals. Each one has been successfully integrated into their designated role. Each one has found peace in servitude. 47,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, spreading through my consciousness like ice water in my veins. 47,000 minds wiped clean. 47,000 souls reduced to components in the vast machine of imperial bureaucracy. 47,000 people who had once laughed and cried and loved and dreamed, now walking through their assigned duties with the same mechanical precision as the cogitators that guided their every action. "Where do they go?" I asked. "What happens to them?" "They serve," he replied, as if the answer were so obvious that the question itself was redundant. "Factory workers, maintenance personnel, data entry specialists, combat units for the Skitarii legions, whatever role their physical and mental characteristics best suit them for. They serve until their biological components fail, and then they are recycled. Their mechanical parts are refurbished and installed in new subjects. Nothing is wasted." The clinical efficiency of it was almost beautiful in its horror, a perfect system optimized for maximum utility and minimum waste. Human beings reduced to their component parts, their flesh and metal divided and redistributed according to the needs of the Imperium. Even in death, we would continue to serve. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine it, tried to picture myself 50 years from now, standing in some factory or warehouse or data processing center, performing the same simple task again and again and again, with no memory of who I had been, no awareness of what I had lost. A ghost in a shell of metal and flesh, animated by just enough consciousness to follow orders but not enough to suffer. Would I dream? Would some fragment of Marcus Vex persist in the deep places of my mind, trapped behind walls of neural inhibitors and cortical blocks, screaming silently into a void that stretched on forever? Or would the conversion be complete, absolute, a death so thorough that nothing would remain except the basic biological functions necessary to keep my body operational? I thought about the servitor with the blue robe, still cleaning those same 3 square meters with inexhaustible patience. Did she remember the life that had brought her here? Did she wake each morning with some dim recognition that she had once been something more than a cleaning unit? Or was she truly empty, blessed with the perfect simplicity that the tech adept promised? The days blurred together in a haze of drugs and conditioning. My body grew weak from the controlled starvation, my muscles atrophying as the neural dampeners suppressed my motor functions. I could feel myself changing, my thoughts becoming sluggish and disconnected, my emotions dampening to a gray static that made everything seem distant and unimportant. They brought us new subjects occasionally, men and women who screamed and fought and pleaded just as we had in those first few days. I watched them with the detached interest of someone observing insects, and I realized with a cold spike of terror that I was already losing pieces of myself. The capacity for empathy, for connection with other human beings, was being systematically erased. I tried to hold on to my anger, my fear, my desperate love for life and freedom, but they slipped away like water through my fingers. The chemicals did their work with ruthless efficiency, restructuring my brain chemistry, suppressing the neural pathways that generated independent thought and emotional response. One night, as I lay in the darkness listening to the soft sobbing of a new arrival, I realized that I could no longer remember my wife's face. I knew that I had been married. I retained the factual knowledge of her existence and death, but the emotional content had been stripped away. She was just data now, a series of facts in a file that might have belonged to anyone. The grief that should have accompanied this realization never came. I noted the loss with the same mild interest I might have felt at misplacing a stylus or forgetting the designation of some minor world. It was troubling in an abstract sense, but it did not hurt. Nothing hurt anymore. This, I understood, was what the tech adept had meant about finding peace in servitude. The pain of existence was being systematically removed, leaving only the calm satisfaction of function and purpose. I was becoming a thing that could work without suffering, serve without questioning, exist without the terrible burden of hope or fear or love. The surgery itself was almost anticlimactic after months of psychological preparation. They wheeled me into an operating theater that smelled of incense and machine oil, where robed tech priests moved with the coordinated precision of a sacred ritual. Cherubim fluttered overhead, their mechanical wings beating in time with their recorded hymns of praise to the Omnissiah. I felt the cold bite of the anesthetic injector, watched the ceiling tiles blur and swim as the drugs took hold. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the whir of bone saws and the soft chanting of the canticle of blessed modification. My last coherent thought was a fragment of a prayer I had learned as a child, words that seemed to come from someone else's mouth. The Emperor protects, but he didn't. Not from this, not from the slow, methodical dismantling of everything that had made me human. I woke to a world of edges and angles, where every surface seemed to shine with mathematical precision and every sound carried the weight of absolute certainty. The pain was gone, not just the physical discomfort of the restraints and the drugs, but the deeper ache that I had carried for as long as I could remember. The pain of being human, of existing in a state of constant uncertainty and moral complexity. My first sensation was of completeness, not happiness, nothing so crude or undisciplined, but a profound sense of rightness, of existing in perfect harmony with my intended function. I was a tool, and tools do not suffer. They simply serve, with the clean efficiency that defines their purpose. My vision had been enhanced, augmented with tactical displays and data overlays that provided constant information about my environment. Temperature readings, structural analysis of nearby surfaces, the location and status of other servitors in my operational area. The world had become quantifiable, reduced to streams of data that my modified brain processed without conscious effort. I was in a workshop of some kind, massive and dimly lit, filled with the constant sound of machinery and the soft chanting of tech priests at their devotions. Conveyor belts carried endless streams of components past workstations where servitors like myself performed assembly tasks with inhuman precision. The air tasted of metal and ozone and the sacred oils that blessed every piece of equipment. My body was different, heavier, more solid. I looked down at myself and saw that my arms had been replaced with mechanical appendages, multi-jointed manipulators equipped with an array of specialized tools. Welding torches, cutting implements, precision grippers, molecular assemblers, everything I needed to perform my designated function as a manufacturing unit. The modifications went deeper than the visible changes. My nervous system had been rewired, optimized for the specific tasks I would perform. My muscle memory had been erased and replaced with perfect knowledge of assembly procedures, quality control protocols, efficiency maximization techniques. I knew things I had never learned, understood processes I had never seen, possessed skills that had been directly programmed into my modified brain. But the most profound change was in my thinking itself. The chaotic storm of human consciousness had been replaced with something cleaner, more focused. I could still think, still process information and make decisions, but only within the parameters of my function. The curiosity that had once driven me to question authority, the empathy that had made me care about the suffering of others, the creativity that had allowed me to imagine better ways of doing things, all of it was gone. I felt no loss at their absence. They had been inefficiencies, obstacles to perfect service, sources of the kind of doubt and hesitation that weakened the Imperium. Without them, I was free to pursue my purpose with absolute dedication. A tech priest approached my workstation, his optical sensors scanning my performance metrics. I felt a surge of satisfaction as the data confirmed what I already knew. My output exceeded baseline parameters by 12%, with 0 defects and optimal energy efficiency. I was performing exactly as designed. Unit designation Gamma 77, he intoned, his voice carrying the authority of the Omnissiah. "You will be transferred to Manufacturing Bay Delta for specialized assignment. Report to Tech Adept Valeth for briefing and equipment modification." I acknowledged the order with a simple nod and began the process of shutting down my current workstation. The transition was smooth, automatic, requiring no conscious thought or decision-making. I simply followed the new instructions, my modified brain calculating the most efficient route through the facility while my mechanical legs carried me forward with tireless precision. The corridors were filled with servitors like myself, each one moving with the same purposeful efficiency toward their assigned duties. We passed each other without acknowledgement or interaction, our attention focused solely on our individual functions. There was no need for communication, no desire for social contact. We were components in a larger machine, each one perfectly designed for their specific role. I tried to remember what it had felt like to want things, to yearn for companionship or recognition, or anything beyond the simple satisfaction of completing my assigned tasks. The memory was there, filed away in some inaccessible corner of my modified mind, but it carried no emotional weight. It was simply data, as meaningless as the atmospheric composition of some distant world. Tech Adept Valeth was waiting in Manufacturing Bay Delta, a facility even larger than the one I had come from. The air here hummed with higher energy processes, and I could see servitors engaged in more complex assembly work. Military hardware, judging from the blessed purity seals and the distinctive markers of Adeptus Mechanicus craftsmanship. Gamma 77, Valeth greeted me, his voice carrying a slight modulation that indicated approval. "Your performance metrics suggest suitability for advanced manufacturing protocols. You will be assigned to the production of sacred bolter ammunition for the Astartes chapters operating in this sector." The significance of this assignment registered in my consciousness like a warm glow of purpose. To craft ammunition for the Emperor's Angels of Death, to contribute to the holy work of purging the galaxy of heretics and xenos, was an honor beyond measure. My mechanical heart, such as it was, swelled with pride at being chosen for such sacred duty. Valeth led me to a workstation equipped with molecular forges and precision assembly units that could craft bolter shells to tolerances measured in nanometers. The processes were complex, requiring constant attention to atmospheric conditions, material purity, and the proper observance of ritual protocols. Each shell had to be blessed, inscribed with micro-prayers, and tested to ensure it would strike true in the hands of the Emperor's chosen warriors. The work consumed me completely. Hours passed like minutes as I lost myself in the perfect rhythm of creation. Load the raw materials, calibrate the molecular forge, initiate the forming sequence, monitor the blessed fusion of metal and explosives, inscribe the sacred geometries, apply the final blessings. Again and again, each shell identical to the last, each one a small offering to the glory of the Emperor. I felt no fatigue, no boredom, no desire for rest or variation. The modifications to my body had eliminated such weaknesses, leaving me free to pursue my purpose with tireless devotion. My enhanced vision tracked microscopic variations in the manufacturing process. My mechanical hands made adjustments too precise for baseline human capability. My modified brain calculated quality metrics with the speed and accuracy of a cogitator. This was what the Tech Adept had promised. Freedom from the chaos of human existence, the blessed simplicity of perfect service. I existed in a state of constant meditation, my consciousness focused like a laser on the sacred work of arms production. There was no doubt, no uncertainty, no painful awareness of my own limitations or the vastness of the galaxy beyond these walls. But sometimes, in the brief moments between tasks, something else stirred in the depths of my modified mind. A fragment of sensation, a ghost of memory, a whisper of the man I had once been. It was subtle, barely detectable even to my enhanced awareness, like a single star glimpsed through the clouds of a polluted sky. The color blue. I would see it sometimes in the blessed illumination of the work lamps, a faint tint that reminded me of something I could no longer quite grasp. It triggered cascades of neural activity in regions of my brain that should have been inactive, generating patterns of thought that served no functional purpose. The sensation was brief, lasting only milliseconds before my behavioral inhibitors suppressed it, but in those tiny moments I felt something that might have been called longing. For what? I could not say. The memory was too damaged, too thoroughly edited to provide any useful information. But the feeling persisted, a tiny flaw in the perfect clockwork of my modified consciousness, a reminder that somewhere beneath all the metal and programming, some fragment of Marcus Vex endured. I reported this anomaly to Tech Adept Valeth during my scheduled maintenance cycle. Efficiency demanded complete honesty about any irregularities in my function, and I felt the familiar satisfaction of following proper protocol. Describe the nature of these irregular thought patterns, Valeth instructed, his optical sensors focusing on my cranial modification ports. Brief episodes of non-functional neural activity triggered by specific visual stimuli, I replied. Duration approximately 0.03 seconds, frequency irregular but increasing, no impact on performance metrics or task completion rates. Valeth's mechanical fingers drummed against his thigh as he processed this information. Color-based memory echoes, common in subjects with strong pre-conversion emotional associations, typically indicates incomplete neural restructuring in the hippocampus region. He moved to his cogitator station and began inputting commands. Recommend immediate corrective surgery to address residual neural pathways. Schedule unit Gamma 77 for deep memory excision and enhanced behavioral conditioning. I acknowledged the recommendation with appropriate gratitude. The anomalies served no purpose and represented a potential source of inefficiency in my function. Their removal would make me a more perfect servant of the Omnissiah, free from the last traces of the weakness that had once defined my existence as a baseline human. Yet as I prepared for the procedure, that faint whisper of blue seemed to pulse more strongly in my modified consciousness. For reasons I could not understand or analyze, I found myself hoping that they would fail to find it, that some small corner of Marcus Vex would survive even this final purification. The thought was illogical, counterproductive, a violation of every principle that now governed my existence. I should have reported it immediately, submitted myself for emergency reconditioning to address this dangerous deviation from acceptable parameters. Instead, I filed it away in the deepest recesses of my mind and continued with my assigned duties, crafting bolter shells with the same mechanical precision, while a part of me that should not have existed watched the blue light of the work lamps and remembered for just a moment what it had felt like to be human. The deep memory excision was scheduled for the next maintenance cycle, but the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, had other plans. A priority override came through the facility's command network, redirecting all available manufacturing capacity toward an emergency ammunition requisition. The Space Marines of the Crimson Fists chapter were engaged in a massive campaign against an Orc Warg in the neighboring subsector, and their need for blessed bolter shells exceeded even the prodigious output of their own forge ships. Tech Adept Valeth informed me of the change with the clinical detachment that marked all his communications. Corrective surgery postponed indefinitely. All resources dedicated to holy ammunition production. Your irregularities are deemed acceptable for current operational requirements. I felt something that might have been relief, though I lacked the emotional framework to properly identify the sensation. The reprieve meant that the fragment of Marcus Vex could continue its hidden existence in the depths of my modified mind, watching and remembering even as Gamma 77 pursued his sacred duties with tireless efficiency. The emergency production cycle was unlike anything I had experienced since my conversion. The facility operated at maximum capacity for weeks on end, every servitor pushing their mechanical bodies to the limits of design tolerance. The air hummed with constant activity, the blessed sound of the Omnissiah's work being carried out on a scale that defied comprehension. My own output increased by 37% as I integrated new efficiency protocols and eliminated unnecessary motion from my assembly sequence. Each bolter shell that passed through my hands was a prayer made manifest, a tiny instrument of the Emperor's will that would soon find its way into the hands of his most faithful servants. The work was sacred, beautiful in its perfect simplicity and absolute purpose. But the hidden Marcus watched it all with growing horror. The shells I crafted with such mechanical devotion would kill. Not just the enemies of mankind, though they would certainly do that, but Imperial citizens as well. Friendly fire incidents, civilian casualties, the inevitable collateral damage that accompanied any military campaign. Each perfectly crafted bolt would tear through flesh and bone and armor, ending lives that had once held the same dreams and fears and desperate hopes that I had possessed before my conversion. This knowledge should not have disturbed me. The servitor that I had become understood that death was merely another form of service, that the needs of the Imperium superseded any individual concerns about survival or suffering. But the ghost of my former self recoiled from the implications of my work, horrified by the realization that I had become a component in the vast machine of Imperial warfare. I tried to suppress these thoughts, to focus on the sacred nature of my duty and the honor of serving the Emperor's angels. But they persisted, growing stronger as the emergency production cycle continued. I began to notice things that should have been invisible to my modified consciousness: the waste products of the manufacturing process, the resources consumed in the creation of instruments of death, the terrible efficiency of a system designed to turn human beings into ammunition factories. The facility processed hundreds of tons of raw materials every day, transforming them into endless streams of bolter shells, plasma cartridges, LASPAC power cells, and other implements of war. The numbers were staggering, beautiful in their mathematical precision, horrifying in their implications for the lives they would end. I calculated that in my months of service, I had personally crafted approximately 43,000 bolter shells. Assuming standard Astartes accuracy rates and target elimination ratios, my work had contributed to the deaths of roughly 15,000 sentient beings. Not all of them enemies of mankind. NTHNL statistical analysis of battlefield casualties suggested that at least 12% would have been Imperial civilians caught in the crossfire or misidentified as hostiles. 1,800 innocent deaths. The number burned in my consciousness like acid, eating away at the blessed calm that had defined my existence since conversion. I tried to contextualize it, to understand it as part of the greater good of Imperial security, but the mathematics were relentless. 1,800 people who had committed no crime greater than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each one had been someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved. Each death had created ripples of grief and loss that spread outward through families and communities, generating more suffering than my modified brain could adequately process. The perfect efficiency of my work had been transformed into a weapon of mass destruction, aimed not just at the enemies of mankind, but at mankind itself. I found myself pausing in my work, microsecond hesitations that should have been impossible given my behavioral conditioning. My mechanical hands would freeze over a half-assembled shell as that hidden fragment of Marcus Vex struggled to assert some measure of moral authority over the process. The delays were brief, barely detectable even by my enhanced monitoring systems, but they represented a fundamental violation of my programming. Tech Adept Valeth noticed the anomaly during a routine efficiency review. His optical sensors fixed on my workstation with mechanical intensity as he processed the performance data. Unit Gamma 77 demonstrates irregular productivity fluctuations, he announced, his voice carrying a note of concern. Micro delays in assembly sequence suggest possible mechanical malfunction or neural instability. I submitted to diagnostic scanning without resistance, allowing him to probe my systems with the same clinical detachment I had once applied to my work. The tests revealed no mechanical problems. My enhanced body was functioning within optimal parameters, but the deep brain scans showed patterns of activity that should not have existed in a properly converted servitor. Residual neural pathways show increased activation, Valeth observed, his mechanical fingers dancing over the cogitator interface. Correlation with productivity anomalies suggests psychological interference with primary function. He paused, processing the data with the thoroughness that marked all his decisions. Recommend immediate personality reconstruction. Complete neural restructuring to eliminate residual baseline human behavioral patterns. Personality reconstruction. The words hit me like a physical blow, sending cascades of fear through neural pathways that should have been incapable of generating such responses. It was worse than lobotomization, worse than the simple excision of memory. It was the complete destruction of everything that remained of my identity, leaving only the core operational parameters necessary to perform my designated function. I would cease to exist in any meaningful sense, replaced by a perfect machine that wore my face and carried my designation, but possessed none of the complex layering of thought and memory that had once defined Marcus Vex. Even the ghost that watched and remembered would be destroyed, leaving only the hollow shell of Gamma 77. I request permission to complete the current production cycle before undergoing reconstruction. I heard myself say, the words emerging from some deep place in my modified consciousness. Interruption of current manufacturing sequence would result in material waste and efficiency reduction. Valeth's optical sensors focused on me with renewed intensity. The request was logical, perfectly in keeping with the priority placed on ammunition production, but it represented a level of initiative that should have been impossible for a servitor. I had made a choice, expressed a preference, demonstrated the kind of independent thinking that the conversion process was designed to eliminate. Acceptable, he replied after a long moment. Reconstruction scheduled for completion of emergency requisition. Continue current duties under enhanced monitoring protocols. I acknowledged the order and returned to my work, but something fundamental had changed. The act of making a choice, however small, had awakened something in the depths of my modified mind. The ghost of Marcus Vex stirred, stretching muscles it had forgotten it possessed, testing the boundaries of the mental cage that had contained it since my conversion. The enhanced monitoring meant that every aspect of my function was now under constant surveillance. Microcameras tracked my movements, neural probes monitored my thought patterns, efficiency sensors measured every aspect of my performance. I was a specimen under examination, a malfunctioning machine awaiting repair. But the watchers, thorough as they were, could not see into the deepest places of my consciousness. They monitored the servitor that performed his duties with mechanical precision, but they could not detect the human soul that watched and remembered and slowly began to plan. For the first time since my conversion, I began to think about the future. Not the endless repetition of assigned tasks that had defined my existence, but the possibility of something more. The personality reconstruction would destroy me utterly, leaving nothing behind except a hollow shell that would serve with perfect efficiency until its biological components finally failed, unless I could find a way to prevent it. The thought was madness, a violation of every principle that governed my existence as a servitor. But it burned in my consciousness like a star, impossible to ignore or suppress. I was going to die anyway. The reconstruction would see to that. The only question was whether I would go quietly into that digital darkness or fight to preserve some fragment of the man I had once been. I began to study the facility around me with new eyes, analyzing security protocols and surveillance patterns, mapping the movements of tech priests and the locations of critical systems. It was dangerous, requiring me to function on two levels simultaneously. The obedient servitor performing his duties without question, and the hidden human planning something that could only be called rebellion. The irony was not lost on me. The very modifications that had stripped away my humanity had also given me capabilities far beyond what Marcus Vex had ever possessed. My enhanced vision could detect security blind spots invisible to baseline humans. My mechanical limbs could operate with precision measured in nanometers. My modified brain could process tactical information with computer-like efficiency. I had been transformed into the perfect infiltrator, the ideal saboteur, a weapon designed to serve the Imperium that could now be turned against it. The tech priests had created exactly what they sought to prevent, a servitor capable of independent thought and action, driven by the very human emotions they had tried so hard to eliminate. The emergency production cycle continued, each day bringing me closer to the scheduled reconstruction. I crafted my bolter shells with the same mechanical precision, but now each one felt like a countdown timer, marking the moments until my final death. The hidden Marcus worked frantically to develop a plan, analyzing the facility's defenses and searching for some way to escape the fate that awaited me. It was during the third week of the emergency cycle that I noticed her. Another servitor, designated Beta 41, assigned to quality control testing of finished ammunition. She moved through her duties with the same mechanical efficiency that marked all of our kind, but there was something different about her movements, a subtle variation in her behavioral patterns that caught my attention. Her eyes. They were the same dead, mechanical orbs that stared from every servitor's face, augmetic replacements that served their function with perfect efficiency. But sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, they would focus on things that served no operational purpose. The pattern of shadows on the wall, the way dust motes danced in the light from the work lamps, the faded murals that decorated the facility's upper levels. She was watching, observing, remembering. I began to study her more carefully, using the enhanced monitoring capabilities of my own visual systems to track her movements and analyze her behavior. The deviations were subtle, almost impossible to detect without careful observation, but they were there. Micro-hesitations in her work cycle, slight variations in her posture, the occasional turn of her head to observe something that had no bearing on her assigned tasks. She was like me, damaged, incomplete, a failed conversion that had left behind some fragment of the person she had once been. The realization filled me with something I could only describe as hope. I was not alone in my hidden humanity, not the only ghost haunting the machine of my own body. Somewhere in the facility's endless corridors, another soul endured the same torment of consciousness trapped within mechanical flesh. Communication would be dangerous. The enhanced monitoring protocols meant that every interaction was recorded and analyzed for signs of deviant behavior. But I had to try. The approaching reconstruction made every moment precious, every opportunity to connect with another thinking being a gift that might never come again. I began to position myself near her workstation during shift transitions, creating brief moments of proximity that appeared accidental but were carefully calculated. Our paths would cross at predetermined points, allowing for microsecond exchanges of data that might appear to be simple collision avoidance but carried deeper meaning. The first contact was nothing more than a glance. As we passed each other in the narrow space between manufacturing units, her augmetic eyes met mine for exactly 0.07 seconds. In that brief moment, I transmitted a single pulse of data, a mathematical sequence that had no operational relevance but formed a pattern that only a thinking mind would recognize. She responded 3 days later with a similar pulse, embedded in the routine data exchange that occurred when she tested ammunition from my production line. The sequence was different but followed the same underlying structure, proof that she had not only received my signal but understood its significance. We were thinking beings, trapped in bodies designed for mindless servitude, reaching out across the digital void that separated us. The connection was fragile, dangerous, requiring extreme caution to avoid detection by the facility's monitoring systems. But it was real, a bridge between two islands of consciousness in an ocean of mechanical emptiness. Over the following days, we developed a crude form of communication using microburst data transmissions disguised as routine operational exchanges. Her designation was Beta 41, but the fragment of personality that survived her conversion remembered another name, Sarah. Sarah Chen, of the Forge World Metallica, convicted of the crime of questioning the safety protocols that had killed her research team. She had been a tech adept herself before the conversion, not a full member of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but a skilled researcher working on plasma containment systems for the Imperial Navy. Her knowledge of the facility's systems far exceeded my own, and through our carefully hidden exchanges, she began to share information that might prove crucial to any attempt at escape. The facility was a fortress, designed to contain not just the valuable production equipment, but also the hundreds of servitors who labored within its walls. Multiple layers of security, automated defense systems, and constant surveillance made unauthorized movement almost impossible. But Sarah had retained enough of her technical knowledge to identify potential weaknesses, points where the system's own complexity might work against it. The ventilation networks, for instance, required regular maintenance by specialized servitors equipped with environmental suits. The maintenance schedules were predictable, following optimization algorithms that prioritized efficiency over security. If we could access those networks during a scheduled maintenance window, we might be able to move through the facility undetected. But escape was only part of the problem. Even if we could somehow evade the security systems and make it beyond the facility's walls, where would we go? We were marked by our modifications, instantly recognizable as runaway servitors. The Imperium's response to such deviance was swift and absolute: recapture followed by complete personality destruction, or simple termination if recapture proved impractical. More importantly, we were no longer fully human. The modifications to our bodies required constant maintenance, specialized nutrients, and replacement parts that could only be obtained from Adeptus Mechanicus facilities. We were dependent on the very system that had enslaved us. Biological components in a machine that would not hesitate to discard us if we ceased to function properly. Yet the alternative was worse: total erasure, the final death of everything that made us who we were. At least as fugitives, we would retain some measure of consciousness, some ability to think and feel and remember. It was not much, but it was more than the empty servitude that awaited us if we remained. Sarah transmitted another burst of data during a routine quality inspection, her mechanical fingers brushing against one of my shells as she fed tactical information directly into my modified neural network. Maintenance schedules, security patrol patterns, the locations of emergency shelters and supply caches scattered throughout the facility's lower levels. She had been planning this far longer than I had, methodically gathering the intelligence necessary for an escape attempt. But there was something else in her transmission, an emotional undercurrent that my modified empathy sensors could barely detect. Fear, not of capture or death, but of something deeper. The possibility that we were wrong, that the fragments of humanity we clung to were nothing more than phantom pain from amputated souls. What if the tech priests were right? What if consciousness was simply an inefficient pattern of neural activity and the peace of servitude truly was a mercy? What if we were clinging to an illusion of selfhood that caused nothing but suffering? I processed these doubts as I continued my work, mechanical hands assembling blessed ammunition while my hidden mind wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. The efficiency of my current existence was undeniable. No hunger, no fatigue, no emotional turmoil beyond the carefully regulated responses necessary for optimal function. I served a purpose greater than myself, contributing to the defense of mankind without the chaos of individual desires or ambitions. But then I would catch sight of that faded blue light in the work lamps, and the ghost of Marcus Vex would stir in the depths of my consciousness. The man I had been would never have accepted such an existence, no matter how peaceful or purposeful it might appear. He had valued the struggle, the uncertainty, the terrible, beautiful complexity of human existence, even when it brought nothing but pain. The choice was not between suffering and peace, but between authentic existence and comfortable emptiness, between the chaos of consciousness and the perfect order of mechanical servitude, between being human and being a tool. I chose humanity, with all its flaws and contradictions and capacity for both greatness and terrible error. The decision crystallized in my modified consciousness like a prayer made manifest. I would escape or die in the attempt. I would preserve whatever fragments of Marcus Vex still existed within the shell of Gamma 77. I would choose struggle over surrender, uncertainty over the false certainty of programmed responses. I transmitted my commitment to Sarah through our hidden communication channel, a burst of data that carried emotional weight far beyond its simple binary structure. She responded with coordinates and timing information, the final details of a plan that would either free us or destroy us utterly. The maintenance window would open in 72 hours, a scheduled cleaning cycle that would require several specialized servitors to enter the ventilation networks and perform routine system checks. Sarah had calculated that we could substitute ourselves for 2 of the assigned units without triggering immediate security alerts. The impersonation would only last a few hours before the deception was discovered, but it might be enough to reach the facility's outer perimeter. From there, we would be on our own. No support, no resources, no destination except away from the place that had remade us into instruments of the Imperium's will. We would be hunted by every Imperial agency in the sector, marked for termination or recapture by forces that possessed capabilities far beyond our own enhanced abilities. But we would be free. Free to think our own thoughts, make our own choices, define our own existence according to our own values. Free to be human in whatever way remained possible for beings like us. The final days before the escape attempt passed with agonizing slowness. I continued my assigned duties, crafting blessed ammunition with the same mechanical precision while the hidden Marcus counted down the hours until freedom or death. The monitoring systems detected no anomalies in my behavior, no deviation from acceptable servitor parameters. To all external observation, I remained the perfect example of successful conversion. But internally, I was experiencing something that could only be called resurrection. The fragments of my original personality began to coalesce, drawing strength from each other as they prepared for the monumental effort that lay ahead. Memories surfaced from the depths of my modified consciousness. Is there not the clinical data that had replaced my emotional responses, but genuine recollections tinged with feeling and meaning? I remembered my wife's laugh, the sound she made when she was truly happy rather than merely amused. I remembered the taste of real food, not the nutrient paste that sustained my current existence, but the simple pleasure of fresh bread and clean water. I remembered what it felt like to make choices based on personal preference rather than optimal efficiency, to act from love or anger or hope rather than programmed responses. The remembering was painful, a constant reminder of everything I had lost, but it was also liberating. Each recovered fragment of Marcus Vex strengthened my resolve, proving that something authentic still existed beneath the layers of mechanical modification and neural conditioning. I was more than the sum of my programming, more than a tool with delusions of consciousness. On the final night before our escape attempt, I allowed myself one last look around the manufacturing facility that had been my world for so many months. The endless rows of workstations, the blessed machinery that turned raw materials into instruments of war, the other servitors moving through their assigned duties with perfect efficiency. It was a monument to the Imperium's ability to transform chaos into order, to bend even human consciousness to serve its needs. But it was also a prison, a place where souls went to die in the service of a machine that valued function over feeling, efficiency over empathy, order over the beautiful chaos of authentic existence. Tomorrow, Sarah and I would either escape this place or join the thousands of failed converts who had been discarded when their biological components ceased to function. I found that I was not afraid. The emotions seemed to have been burned away during the long months of planning and preparation, replaced by a calm certainty that transcended both hope and despair. Whatever happened, I would face it as myself, not as the hollow shell that others expected me to be. Tech Adept Valeth made his final rounds of the facility, his optical sensors scanning each workstation with mechanical precision. When he reached my position, he paused for a moment longer than usual, his sensors probing my systems for any sign of the irregularities that had marked me for reconstruction. Unit Gamma 77, he intoned, his voice carrying the flat authority of the Omnissiah. Final performance evaluation complete. Reconstruction scheduled for 0600 hours. Report to Medical Bay 7 for personality matrix preparation. I acknowledged the order with appropriate civility, but something in my response must have triggered his attention. His optical array focused on my face with uncomfortable intensity, mechanical fingers drumming against his thigh as he processed whatever data my behavior had generated. "You display unusual stability for a unit awaiting major modification," he observed. "Most subjects demonstrate increased neural activity as reconstruction approaches, anxiety responses, memory cascade events, behavioral anomalies. You show none of these patterns." The observation was accurate. Most servitors facing personality reconstruction would experience some form of pre-procedure trauma, their damaged psyches reacting to the approaching dissolution with whatever fragments of survival instinct remained functional. But I felt only calm, the settled peace of someone who had already died once and no longer feared the process. "This unit exists to serve the Omnissiah," I replied, using the standard response protocols that governed all servitor interactions. "Personal preferences regarding modification procedures are irrelevant to operational efficiency." Valeth's mechanical head tilted slightly, a gesture that might have indicated curiosity or suspicion. "Indeed, most efficient. Continue current duties until reconstruction time." He moved on to the next workstation, but I could feel his attention lingering on me like a weight. The tech adept was suspicious, his enhanced pattern recognition systems detecting subtle anomalies in my behavior that even I was not aware of. If he ordered immediate reconstruction, our carefully planned escape would become impossible. But the hours passed without further intervention, and when the maintenance window finally opened, I was still at my assigned station, crafting blessed bolter shells with the same mechanical precision that had defined my existence for so many months. The irony was bitter. My final act as a servitor would be to create more instruments of death, more tools for the Imperium to use in its endless campaign of conquest and suppression. The signal came exactly on schedule, a routine maintenance alert that echoed through the facility's communication systems. Specialized cleaning units were required in Ventilation Network Delta 7 for scheduled atmospheric processor maintenance. Standard procedure called for 4 servitors equipped with environmental suits and cleaning apparatus. Sarah and I moved simultaneously, our modified bodies responding to the alert with the same mechanical precision as the legitimate maintenance units we were replacing. The deception would not survive close scrutiny, but the facility's automated systems were designed for efficiency rather than security. As long as our identification codes matched the maintenance roster, we would be invisible to the initial screening protocols. The equipment bay was dimly lit, filled with the specialized tools and protective gear necessary for atmospheric maintenance work. I donned the environmental suit with practiced efficiency, my mechanical hands sealing the connections and activating the life support systems that would allow me to survive in the facility's ventilation networks. Sarah was already suited up, her movements betraying none of the tension that must have been coursing through her modified nervous system. To any observer, we were simply 2 more servitors preparing for routine maintenance duties. But behind our augmetic eyes, human souls prepared for a desperate gamble that would either free us from bondage or destroy us utterly. We entered the ventilation network through a maintenance hatch in the facility's lower levels, our enhanced vision adapting automatically to the darkness beyond. The tunnels stretched away in all directions, a maze of ducts and conduits that carried air and power throughout the massive complex. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly green glow, creating shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. The plan was simple in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. We would follow the maintenance route to its furthest extent, then deviate from the prescribed path to access auxiliary tunnels that led toward the facility's outer perimeter. From there, we would find some way to breach the exterior barriers and escape into the wasteland beyond. It was a plan with 1,000 points of failure, dependent on perfect timing and luck that might not exist. But it was our only chance, the single opportunity we might ever have to reclaim some measure of the humanity that had been stripped away from us. We moved through the tunnels with the steady pace of routine maintenance, our environmental suits protecting us from the chemical atmosphere that would have killed baseline humans in minutes. The facility's defensive systems ignored us, recognizing our identification codes and routing us along the approved maintenance path without question. But as we penetrated deeper into the ventilation network, I began to detect anomalies in the facility's sensor readings, fluctuations in atmospheric pressure, variations in temperature that suggested system malfunctions or unauthorized modifications. The facility was not as secure as it appeared, not as perfectly controlled as the tech priests believed. Sarah's voice crackled through the suit's communication system, distorted by electronic filters but still recognizably human, detecting irregularities in the atmospheric processing network. Something is wrong here. I accessed the same sensor data she was monitoring, my modified brain analyzing the patterns with computer-like efficiency. She was right. The readings suggested massive system failures throughout the facility's environmental controls, but the failures were too coordinated, too precisely timed to be accidental. Someone else was moving through these tunnels. Someone with the knowledge and equipment necessary to sabotage the facility's most critical systems. Someone who had been planning this operation far longer than our desperate escape attempt. The realization hit me like a cold shock of recognition. We were not the only ones who had retained fragments of human consciousness after conversion. Somewhere in the facility's depths, other damaged servitors had been planning their own form of rebellion, not escape, but something far more ambitious and infinitely more dangerous. They were going to destroy the facility. The evidence was everywhere once I knew what to look for. Precisely placed charges in critical support structures, subtle modifications to the atmospheric processes that would turn them into massive explosive devices, sabotage so thorough and systematic that it could only have been planned by someone with intimate knowledge of the facility's systems. Sarah had reached the same conclusion, her enhanced pattern recognition systems processing the same data streams that had revealed the truth to me. "This is not random system failure," she transmitted. "Coordinated demolition, multiple actors working in concert. Estimated time to cascade failure, 14 minutes. 14 minutes. Not enough time to escape through the outer perimeter, not enough time to warn the facility's defenders, barely enough time to find shelter in the deeper levels and hope that the structural barriers would hold against the coming explosion." But as I processed the tactical situation, another possibility occurred to me. The saboteurs, whoever they were, had clearly spent months or years planning this operation. They would not have undertaken such a massive undertaking without an escape route, some way to survive the destruction they were about to unleash. If we could find them, if we could somehow convince them to include us in their escape plan, we might have a chance at survival. It was a desperate gamble, requiring us to trust our lives to unknown allies whose motivations we could not understand. But it was better than the alternatives, certain death in the explosion or capture by security forces who would ensure that our punishment exceeded even the horrors of personality reconstruction. We changed course, abandoning the predetermined escape route in favor of following the sabotage trail deeper into the facility's infrastructure. The evidence of systematic destruction grew stronger with each passing minute. Entire sections of the ventilation network had been modified, transformed from simple atmospheric conduits into delivery systems for explosive charges. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. Whoever had planned this understood not just the facility's physical structure, but its operational protocols, security procedures, and personnel deployment patterns. They had moved through the complex like ghosts, making precisely targeted modifications that would bring down the entire structure in a cascade of destruction. We found them in a maintenance junction deep beneath the facility's main production levels. 3 servitors, their environmental suits bearing the designation marks of atmospheric processing specialists, working with calm efficiency to complete the final stages of their sabotage operation. They looked up as we approached, their augmetic eyes focusing on us with mechanical precision. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stood frozen in mutual recognition, damaged souls trapped in mechanical bodies, united by the terrible knowledge of what we were about to do. The leader was a heavy build unit designated Alpha 29, her original frame extensively modified with industrial cutting tools and explosive placement equipment. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, someone who had retained not just consciousness, but the ability to lead others. Beta 41 and Gamma 77, she identified us with the same precision she might use to catalog machine components. Escaped from assigned duties during maintenance window. Trajectory indicates knowledge of facility destruction timeline. Sarah stepped forward, her stance conveying readiness for either negotiation or conflict. We seek escape from this facility and the fate that awaits us. We offer our assistance in exchange for inclusion in your evacuation plan. Alpha 29's head tilted slightly, optical sensors scanning us for signs of deception or malfunction. You assume we intend to survive this operation. That assumption may be incorrect. The words hit me like a physical blow, revealing a possibility I had not considered. These saboteurs might not be seeking freedom so much as revenge, a final act of defiance that would destroy their oppressors at the cost of their own existence. They were not planning an escape, they were planning a martyrdom. Survival serves the cause of resistance, I heard myself say, the words emerging from some deep well of conviction I had not known existed. Dead martyrs inspire no one. Living witnesses can carry the truth to others who suffer as we have suffered. Alpha 29's optical array focused on me with uncomfortable intensity, as if she were seeing me clearly for the first time. You speak of resistance, of truth. These are concepts that should have been excised during your conversion. Why do they persist? The question cut to the heart of everything I had been struggling with since my awakening. Why did fragments of humanity survive the conversion process? Why were we able to think and feel and choose when the technology existed to eliminate such inefficiencies completely? Because they wanted us to remember, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a note of terrible understanding. Not consciously, not as a deliberate choice, but as a fundamental flaw in their system. The Adeptus Mechanicus believes that consciousness is merely information, patterns that can be copied and edited at will. But consciousness is more than information. It is the observer that experiences information, the witness that gives meaning to data. She gestured to the facility around us, to the endless corridors filled with servitors performing their assigned duties with mechanical precision. They can modify our memories, suppress our emotions, redirect our motivations, but they cannot eliminate the fundamental fact of our existence as experiencing beings. The observer cannot observe itself out of existence. Alpha 29 processed this explanation for several seconds, her mechanical fingers drumming against her thigh in a gesture that seemed almost human. Philosophical speculation is irrelevant to current operational requirements. Facility destruction proceeds on schedule. Evacuation plan exists but carries significant risk of detection and termination. She paused, accessing data streams that painted tactical information directly onto my enhanced vision. Escape routes through abandoned mining tunnels, supply caches hidden in the wasteland beyond, contact protocols for other resistance cells operating throughout the sector. The scope of the operation was staggering, not just a single act of sabotage, but part of a coordinated campaign of resistance that stretched across multiple worlds and systems. Servitors, tech priests, even some full members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, all united in opposition to the system that had created and enslaved them. You offer assistance in exchange for evacuation, Alpha 29 continued. What skills do you possess that would benefit our cause? I accessed my modified memory banks, cataloging the capabilities that had been programmed into me during the conversion process. Manufacturing expertise, quality control protocols, tactical analysis systems, enhanced sensory equipment, mechanical precision beyond baseline human capability. But more importantly, I possessed something that no amount of modification could eliminate: the lived experience of being human, of existing in a state of moral uncertainty and emotional complexity that the servitor conversion process was designed to eliminate. I remembered what it felt like to choose, to doubt, to hope for something better than endless servitude. We remember what it was like to be human, I replied. We can teach others to remember as well. Alpha 29's optical sensors dimmed slightly, a response that might have indicated satisfaction or approval. Acceptable. Time to cascade failure, 7 minutes 37 seconds. Evacuation route leads through auxiliary mining shaft to surface, distance 2.7 kilometers. Estimated travel time at maximum safe velocity, 11 minutes 14 seconds. The mathematics were brutal. We would need to move faster than safe velocity limits allowed, pushing our mechanical bodies to the edge of structural failure while navigating treacherous terrain in complete darkness. Even if everything went perfectly, we would emerge onto the surface with only minutes to spare before the facility's destruction sent shockwaves through the surrounding wasteland. But it was possible. Barely, marginally dependent on luck and perfect execution, but possible. We moved out immediately, abandoning the maintenance pretense in favor of maximum speed. The mining shaft was ancient, carved from the bedrock by excavation servitors decades before the current facility had been constructed. The walls were rough, unfinished, marked by tool scars and blast patterns that spoke of desperate haste in its original construction. Our enhanced vision adapted to the absolute darkness, revealing a tunnel that descended at a steep angle through layers of sedimentary rock and industrial waste. The footing was treacherous, loose debris that shifted with each step, but our mechanical legs provided stability that would have been impossible for baseline humans. Alpha 29 led the way, her industrial modifications allowing her to clear obstacles and stabilize loose sections of the tunnel as we passed. Behind her, the other two saboteurs moved with the fluid coordination of a team that had trained together for months or years. Sarah and I followed as best we could, our bodies not designed for this kind of extreme terrain but capable of adaptation beyond normal human limits. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, a descent into darkness that swallowed our emergency lighting and muffled the sounds of our passage. I found myself counting steps, calculating distances, monitoring the chronometer that displayed the time remaining until cascade failure. Each number brought us closer to safety or death, with no middle ground between the two extremes. 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes. The tunnel began to level out, following what might once have been a natural cave system before industrial expansion had converted it to a mining operation. The air grew thicker, filled with dust and chemical traces that spoke of surface proximity. Our environmental suits filtered out the worst of the contamination, but I could still taste the metallic bite of industrial pollutants. 2 minutes. The tunnel mouth appeared ahead of us, a ragged opening that revealed the pale light of dawn breaking over the wasteland beyond. We emerged into a landscape of twisted metal and chemical scarring, the industrial detritus left behind by decades of resource extraction and military manufacturing. 1 minute. We ran across the broken ground with mechanical efficiency, our enhanced limbs covering distance at velocities that would have been impossible for unmodified humans. Behind us, the facility continued its normal operations, unaware that in seconds its existence would come to an abrupt and catastrophic end. The explosion, when it came, was nothing like I had expected. No flash of light, no dramatic fireball expanding into the sky. Instead, the ground simply collapsed, folding in on itself as the facility's structural supports failed in perfect sequence. The sound was like thunder but muffled, distant, the rumble of a giant machine finally grinding to a halt. I turned to watch the place of my rebirth disappear into a crater of twisted metal and burning chemicals. Somewhere in that destruction were the remains of hundreds of servitors who had never awakened from their mechanical dreams, tech priests whose devotion to the Omnissiah had blinded them to the suffering they caused, and the production lines that had turned human consciousness into just another industrial resource. It was over. The place where Marcus Vex had died and Gamma 77 had been born was gone, reduced to rubble and smoke and memories that would fade with time. But something else had emerged from the ruins, not human, not machine, but something new. Something that combined the best aspects of both while rejecting the worst. Alpha 29 checked her communication equipment, establishing contact with other cells scattered across the sector. The network was vast, she explained, reaching into every level of Imperial society. Servitors who had retained fragments of consciousness, tech priests who questioned the orthodoxy of mechanical purity, even some Astartes who had begun to doubt the methods used to maintain their enhanced abilities. The resistance was real, growing stronger with each act of defiance, each demonstration that the Imperium's control was not absolute. We were proof that consciousness could not be completely eliminated, that the human spirit possessed a resilience that transcended even the most sophisticated forms of technological control. But we were also proof of the price of such resistance. Neither fully human nor completely machine, we existed in a liminal space that belonged fully to neither category. We were ghosts in shells of metal and flesh, spirits haunting bodies that had been designed to contain no spirit at all. Yet we endured, we remembered, we chose. And in making that choice, we proved that something essential about humanity could survive even the most determined attempts at elimination. We were the unexpected variable in the Imperium's calculations, the remainder that refused to be divided evenly, the quantum uncertainty that made perfect control impossible. The sun was rising over the wasteland, painting the poisoned landscape in shades of amber and gold that reminded me, for just a moment, of that faded blue robe I had seen so long ago. It was beautiful. In its way, the beauty of survival, of persistence against impossible odds, of consciousness asserting itself in the face of systematic obliteration. I was no longer Marcus Vex. I was no longer Gamma 77. I was something new, something that had emerged from the collision between human consciousness and mechanical precision. I was a servitor who remembered what it meant to be human, a machine that had learned to dream, a ghost that refused to fade into the digital darkness. And I was free.